Hi, everyone. We are live right now, and Sharon, I would like you to begin.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here on behalf of the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Education and on behalf of University of Pennsylvania's Perry Worldhouse, both a co-sponsor of this event and a tremendous support of our work. We welcome you to this unusual and generative conversation, the first hopefully of many, and the second of many of us in this group. Our aim in this discussion today, and then for ongoing dialogue, is to have academics and practitioners and representatives of the state come together to think about challenges and promising practices and policies to humanize and improve education and around the world. And so we're absolutely honored to have this panel of people who live at the nexus of theory, research, practice, and policy. And my colleague, Usama Mahmoud, who is a visiting scholar here at the University of Pennsylvania, will introduce our esteemed panel.
Thanks, Sharon. So for our audience, we have a panel of 4 experts, policymakers, development practitioners today with us. I'll introduce all of them. We have Dr. Yor Odutwam, who is the Minister of Education of Ghana. We have Robert Jenkins, Director Education, UNICEF. We were supposed to have Jaime Saavedra, the Global Director from the World Bank, but he has an urgent mission, so we wish him the best of luck. We have Tricia Wind, Program Lead at Knowledge Innovation Exchange. It's a joint program of GPE and IDRC. And we have Matt Brossard, the Chief of Education of UNICEF Office of Research. We would like to begin our discussion with the respected Minister, Dr. Odutwam. Dr. Odutwam, as someone who has served as a teacher himself, and even as the Minister of Education, someone who has the teacher-in-chief philosophy that we have read about and heard about a lot, we believe you can look at the challenges from both a macro level and from the grassroots level. Please tell us a bit about the key challenges that you see for the Ghanaian education system from a teacher-in-chief perspective. And we would love to learn about some of the interventions, innovations that you are implementing to address these pressing challenges in Ghana.
Thank you for such a wonderful opportunity and inviting me to be part of this panel. Before we talk about Ghana, let me say something briefly about California, where I lived for over 20 years and taught for 10 years, and the rest of the time serving as a charter school developer and leader, and also going to University of Southern California, where I did my PhD in education, policy, and administration. So when you talk about the nexus between policy, risk, practice, and research, I can identify with that. I became the Minister for Education in Ghana. What I have observed before and now is that we have one of the greatest opportunities for education transformation, because we have a president who has committed tremendous amount of national resources for education development, putting us in a place where we have over $1 billion now to be invested in STEM education, specifically building universities focused on STEM, high schools focused on STEM. It's such a great opportunity to be in the country at this time. Yes, there are some challenges, and the challenges is starting from teacher quality, also to infrastructure issues and challenges, weak accountability regime in the country, but overall, we have what it takes to create a very robust education system. So when you talk about the teacher-in-chief kind of thinking or philosophy. It emanates from the fact that in this country, our teachers feel underappreciated. They don't feel we can identify even with them as leaders of the education system. So when I was the Deputy Minister for Education, they were amazed when they saw me in the classrooms teaching. During the COVID era, I did a taping of some algebra lessons that were broadcast to students across the country. And the teachers were amazed because they thought we couldn't identify with them. So when they saw me teaching, which I did very happily when I'm out in the country and I come across a school, I just stop by and the teacher in me could not stop taking the chalk or the marker and teaching. And the idea here is that for the teachers to understand that we understand them, we can identify with them, we appreciate their challenges, and coming to the classroom to teach is to remind them that their profession is well respected and very well valued by those of us in the political establishment. And taking from there, becoming the minister, I have made teacher issues the #1 issues of the ministry, because I believe that if we can improve the teachers and allow them to acquire skills that enable them to perform better, we will get a much better education system. So what I try to do at this point is to reinforce our teacher licensing regime. For many, many years, teachers didn't have to go through any licensing or credentialing, as we call it in the US. You go to a college of education, from there you just go to the classroom and you teach, and nobody will ask you about anything. But now we have developed a teacher credentialing in Ghana. We are now going to move on to administrative credentialing so that you cannot head a school without some kind of credential. But one of the things that we also do is ensure that we create professional learning communities. Unlike other places in the world, like in the US, where you have people free days, days set aside for teachers to go through professional development, there was nothing like that in Ghana. Now we have begun, at least at the primary and junior high school level, setting some days aside where our teachers can receive professional development, and we are moving it up to the high school level. So professional development is something that we are taking seriously in the country. And developing professional learning communities, these are critical things. Talking about even something as simple as lesson plans, and teachers were not allowed to type it and email it or WhatsApp it, wherever it is. They had to put it on a piece of paper and hand it to the headmaster, and that is no longer the case. We have to let them know that it's the 21st century. Every teacher in the country is also getting a laptop from the government. And now we're going to move on to digitization of the learning process and learning materials. We believe that for us to catch up with the rest of the world, we have to do some leapfrogging. Recently, there was a study by the Brookings Institution, and they look at the fact that it takes over 100 years for us to catch up with the rest of the world in terms of education quality, access, and relevance. But the good news is that they also said if you could leapfrog, you'll be able to join our friends in the western part of the world. If you look at secondary education in Ghana, it was not free. Consequently, only about 52% of junior high school graduates who go to high school. The last 4 years, the government has made it free. Even boarding school is free. And as a result, we are now seeing a huge increase in secondary enrollment, beginning with 800,000 students in 2016, and now it's in the next academic year, 1.3 million plus. Our students are going to be in high school. And we had to use year-round schooling, which I brought from, to a large extent, from my experience in California, where we did year-round schools in the 1990s, because there was a huge increase in enrollment in the schools, and also high school became 4 years in California and needed more infrastructure. So yes, infrastructure issues, and we are solving it, are borrowing from California. And there was no way we're going to be able to build all the facilities before we started free senior secondary education. And now we have been able to do that because we use year-round schooling strategy. So our nation is poised for a major transformation education system. We are willing to learn from anywhere in the world where we can find some new ideas and bring it to Ghana. Ghana believes that we can compete with the rest of the world in education because without that, we're going to be stuck here for a long time in terms of socioeconomic transformation. Now, the pandemic taught us some very, very critical lessons as a nation. When we were struggling to get vaccines, it taught us something, that unless we transform ourselves and really transform our nation, we could be at peril. In the sense that we couldn't get vaccines. We had to go and beg and looking for some of that to buy was even a problem. So the pandemic has created a sense of urgency for us. In the education system, we're also looking at what we can do better in the face of the pandemic, distance education, virtual learning. So places where we don't have the wet lab, we're looking at how can we use virtual labs to ensure that we can improve the teaching and learning of science. So the effect of the pandemic to me, it's not so much the fact that it causes so much havoc in terms of shutting down schools, but the sense of urgency has created for us is something we couldn't have paid billions of dollars for. And consequently, we look at the pandemic from a very positive perspective in terms of how we wake up. And as you guys say in America, smell the coffee and do whatever needs to be done so that we can change our education system.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Adelton. Thank you so much. That was insightful. And you very correctly mentioned that pandemic has added a new layer of challenges to the already existing challenges in the education system. And here I would like to ask Robert Jenkins about Learning Passport. So Learning Passport is a new solution designed to close the learning poverty gap. And it was ranked amongst the best inventions of 2021 by Times. So Robert, please tell us a little bit about Learning Passport and how has this innovation facilitated the provision of quality education across different contexts, particularly in times like these?
Well, thanks. I'll build on what His Excellency had just also mentioned, and thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate this. I really appreciate the minister's comments on the need for action, the recognition of the crisis we're currently experiencing. I do want to flag, of course, that the world was experiencing a global learning crisis before the pandemic, and now the pandemic has exacerbated it. It's a crisis upon a crisis, affecting the most marginalized children around the world by the most. But when we think about marginalized children, I'm not talking about 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000 children. I'm talking about the majority of children in low and middle income countries are experiencing a learning crisis, meaning the system is failing to provide an opportunity for them to acquire the skills, whether at 5 years old to start school, 10 years old with foundational literacy, numeracy, or as they exit the school system as adolescents to have the full range of skills required to be successful in adulthood. So crisis upon a crisis. Technology, I'm glad you raised the Learning Passport. I think technology is going to be part of the solution. It has an incredible, it's showing to have great potential in addressing the learning crisis if done well, and I'll speak a little bit about that. But again, it's no mean the only solution. It can't be seen as the silver bullet, but definitely as a piece of the puzzle. We feel at UNICEF that leveraging technology and crowding in additional partners with learning tools and with resources is going to be key in addressing learning loss. And we see governments and countries that have leapfrogged. Often at the center of that is a partnership with technology used appropriately with a laser focus on how to reach children that are affected by pre-existing barriers to their realizing their right to education. That may be adolescent girls in many, many countries, and children with disabilities in other countries, and children living in poverty, remote locations. So starting of how do we reach those children that are facing those barriers and bridge them back into the system and accelerate their learning using technology. I do want to flag that the impact of the crisis has been profound beyond learning loss, but also on social emotional health and mental health. And just to flag that when we talk about education, reaching children, we need to also expand our approach in education to leverage our interactions at schools and outreach from schools to address children's holistic needs beyond learning as well. And technology can play a role in that. I'm going to spend just a couple of few minutes the last bit of time I have right here, just flagging some concrete more examples. In Vietnam, we are partnering with SAP and other leading tech companies and rolling out a digital literacy and skills program. It's reaching 21 million children. It's showing incredible potential. In Kenya and Uganda, partnered with government and other tech companies also to enable technology to be leveraged to enable textbooks to become accessible to disabled children. It's also showing great promise in overcoming barriers that children with disabilities were facing pre-COVID and during this time. In Jordan, we are rolling out what's called the Learning Bridges, or it has been rolled out with the government and others. That provides life skills, opportunities for youth and adolescents to acquire life skills, and life skills, 21st century skills or transferable skills. We call them so many different things. Basically, problem solving, creative thinking, working with others, these proving critical skills to transition to adulthood. And again, it's been an incredible tool. The Learning Passport specifically, it's a partnership with Microsoft, leveraging their very powerful learning tools. It is adapted at country level based on local content, bringing in local content and adjusting the pathways that children follow to meet their specific needs and goals. It's in over 10 countries. It's growing very, very quickly. There's over 1 million children around the world engaged in it. It's a hard tool to summarize because it depends on the country and the focus of the tool. I guess how you summarize it is it's very diverse, it's very powerful, and it's very, it can be modified. So again, which is one of the key lessons on technology and moving forward tech-enabled learning is so that it is context specific and meets children's needs and reaches them where they are in their learning and in the context in which they live. So we're really excited by our partnership with Microsoft. We're really excited about the scale that it's aspiring and to the number of children it's aspiring to reach, and its transformative impact again to address the learning crisis. I want to pick up also on, maybe as I'm wrapping up, on the minister's comment on the importance of teachers and engaging with teachers, and that is a critical component of this much needed transformation. How to provide support to teachers comprehensively. We are seeing how technology, including the Learning Passport, can also be an incredibly powerful tool for teachers, for them to enable them to facilitate the learning of their students in their classroom. So kind of providing a tool that enables them to tailor and engage in different ways with students. It can, not to get too much in the weeds here, but the Learning Passport and other tools that in the hands of teachers can enable them to assess learning more rapidly. And obviously assessment of learning, knowing where children are in a classroom, is a key part of starting to teach children at the right level and enable children to accelerate. It also provides just an enormous amount of resources, whether that be videos or interactive tools or direct access to children to those tools is showing to also have great potential for learning. And so I want to end with just to clarify and conclude with the Learning Passport and other tools I've mentioned are showing great potential. They've accelerated over the last 20 months. due to the disruption of education systems as a result of COVID-19. They are a piece of the solution. We're learning a lot collectively on what is working and what needs to continue to be built and strengthened. But an overall focus has to be to reverse the growing disparities that we are seeing as a result of COVID-19, which relates to the pre-existing barriers that children face and how to leverage technology to overcome those.
Thanks a lot, Rob. And before we wind up, I think I would like to have a comment from your end on the fact that there's a lot of digital inequity, and you spoke about inequity right now. There's a lot of digital inequity, particularly in the global South. So does the Learning Passport, as you just mentioned, that it can be customized for different contexts, does the Learning Passport cater to students and teachers with low connectivity?
It does indeed, and that's maybe one of them. Maybe I should have mentioned that up front, but one of the unique capacities of the Learning Passport is its ability to work offline and its ability to manage whole different types of tech formats and file formats, etc. So it has pushed Microsoft and ourselves to adapt the technology to meet some very, very challenging remote environments. And perhaps that's maybe one of its that and other characteristics is one of its greatest assets.
Thank you so much, Robert. And before I hand over the session to Sharon, I would like to ask our audience that if they have any questions, please feel free to type it in the chat box. We'll be looking at your questions, and we have a buffer of 10 to 15 minutes towards the end, and we'll try to take your questions as well. Please.
Thanks. So Tricia, as program lead of KICS, I have two questions, and as we discussed, I'll ask them to you together. For a large-scale impact system-level change, it's imperative to evaluate the impact of pilot interventions and understand the scaling of this. So first, how exactly is the KICS endeavor supporting the policymakers and practitioners in making evidence-based decisions? And second, what emerging insights from KICS projects demonstrate the importance of applied research? And I hand it over to you.
Great, thanks. So hello to everyone. It's an honor to be part of this panel. GPE KICS is a bit new, so I thought maybe I would just take a moment to introduce it as a way of into answering your questions. Participants in today's session are probably pretty familiar with the Global Partnership for Education, the multi-stakeholder partnership and funding platform to strengthen education systems in the Global South. The Knowledge and Innovation Exchange, or KICS, is a relatively new mechanism of GPE. KICS was born from a request from countries supported through GPE who all sent representatives to regional and global meetings ahead of GPE board meetings. Because in addition to inputting into GPE business, they found the discussions that they were having in the breaks and over lunch with peers from other countries were extremely helpful. They started to set up their own side sessions for sharing ideas and challenges. And over time, they proposed that they would appreciate having a more systematic way to learn from each other and have ready access to relevant evidence and innovation. So at heart, that is what KICS is for. There are 4 regional hubs that are the core of KICS's design. You can think of these hubs as sort of knowledge networks in which people who work in education systems across the Global South participate in ongoing peer learning and exchanging and engaging with evidence. These people include people from the Ministry of Education, for instance, like the Director of Planning or people from the Gender Unit, people also from the national stakeholders who convene in local education groups. Countries nominate a set of people to participate in the hub on an ongoing basis, and from there, the grouping expands as people join for different topics that are of interest to them. Hubs started their work by identifying the common priorities on which countries at the regional level wanted to learn and share. This was based on an analysis of their education sector plans, regional studies, and very importantly, from surveys and interviews with the people who are working in those education systems. So to answer your question, the first way that we are trying to support policymakers and practitioners in evidence-based decision-making is by starting with them and framing a knowledge agenda around how they articulate their interests and concerns. So from there, each hub developed a variety of opportunities for peer exchange to facilitate learning across countries, to engage with evidence, expertise, and global public goods. I thought I'd give a couple of examples of what this looks like and how it connects. So for instance, in Francophone countries in West and Central Africa, teacher training arose as the top area of concern. We've already heard about that with the two previous speakers. The quality of teachers is the most important influence on student learning outcomes. But in several countries in that region, the majority of the teaching cadre try to manage, despite having had themselves perhaps not a lot of education, let alone sufficient training in how to be teachers. So the hub that brings together those countries organized a set of webinars on teachers and teacher training. Country representatives would share what they're doing. For instance, from Djibouti, Senegal, and Niger, talked about their experiences. These were engaging roundtable formats in which they were engaging with each other and with people from other countries were able to tap their shoulders and ask questions. Peer-to-peer learning can lead to fairly immediate policy learning. So for instance, representatives from Guinea heard about Senegal's teacher professional development policy and realized that it would be a useful model as they were trying to formulate their own. Evidence is also really important to address gaps in policy implementation. So as another example, 70% of countries involved in the Latin American and Caribbean hub have policies for inclusive education, but in half of them, teacher training doesn't really address how to teach students with special needs. So there's this gap between a policy and its implementation. So the hub has organized sessions with UNESCO to share global guidance on teacher policy development and implementation, and importantly, really open the space for people to talk about how they were using those guidelines. What of those were really relevant to the specific challenges they were having? It's one thing to have global public goods, but sometimes it takes a little bit more scaffolding and peer learning to figure out how to really use them. A third element that we're seeing in our regional hubs to support evidence use is by providing support for people to develop their own national evidence for their own policy needs. Our Europe Asia Pacific Hub has been supporting a number of learning cycles in which country representatives work collaboratively together and engage with international experts to develop and document their own national policy initiatives, innovations, or document their challenges. It's in order to surface, make rigorous, and share their own experiences. So just example again, there was a learning cycle which supported people from 11 different countries to begin to more deliberately use geospatial mapping tools to develop sort of and analyze evidence around education equity and gender equality issues. And this can be so immediately practicable. Cambodia's planning department reported using their geospatial data to present evidence on which districts had low performance and high dropout rates. And they put that straight into their midterm review of their education sector plan. So that's just 3 ways in which we're trying to support the use of evidence through peer learning, engaging with existing evidence and global best practice, and developing national level evidence, always in the context of inter-country dialogue and exchange. So to your second question about sort of in the context of scaling, have there been emerging insights from KICS about the importance of applied research? So the regional hubs that I was just talking about are one part of KICS. The other is that we use the priorities that were surfaced from those education systems to develop calls for proposals. And we are now funding a set of 36 applied research projects with work in over 50 countries. The research that we fund is engaged and applied. And there are a couple of common threads throughout, even though they're dealing with very different topics. Overall, we've been looking for promising or proven approaches to address education system challenges, and our research is really about how their impact can be scaled. And I want to sort of clarify that a little bit. A lot of research is about understanding issues and contexts. A lot of education research has focused on developing interventions and testing them. And that is so important. We need to know what is effective in, for instance, improving learning outcomes. So those pilots and the testing of those pilot interventions are super important. However, there is a challenge, and it's well beyond education. This happens in agriculture and lots of other sectors. There are a lot of promising or proven education or innovations that work really well as pilots or in small areas or in specific populations. And sometimes the research has actually stopped at testing the pilot with the idea that you hand over the intervention now to the implementers and they will move it ahead. But there can be so many challenges in trying to scale something that has worked at a pilot level. And it works very differently. Sometimes it doesn't work as well when you're trying to scale it. I think we all know of examples. So in KICS, what we're trying to do is to make a contribution to the growing field of research on scaling impact. So how do you adapt and contextualize innovative approaches, test and figure out what is needed to successfully scale the impact of those? And there's a lot to this. Sometimes scaling really requires a whole mental shift. So for instance, many pilots are designed to be really excellent, have great outcomes. Sometimes they can get a bit complicated though, and they assume that there's a lot of external support, even just the monitoring of them as a separate initiative. A lot of effort is to support them to be effective. But one of the lessons about scaling is that sometimes the most important thing to do is strip off and simplify the intervention so it can actually work without all of that surround. So maybe an example of what this looks like. I'll just use another EdTech example, as we were just talking about that. There's a project that's developed educational technologies to work specifically with refugees, displaced communities, and host populations. It's a project that's being led by the War Child Holland, but is being implemented in conjunction with national partners in Chad, Sudan, and Uganda, including the University of Khartoum. One of their first research questions is, how do you distill the complexity of the previous implementation phases to arrive at a replicable solution? So they have to start with, how do you simplify the intervention so it can scale? Not only, though, do you have to look at the intervention, you have to look at the context in which that intervention is supposed to scale. An obvious issue, of course, is adapting the content of whatever EdTech so that it's relevant and aligned with relevant curriculum nationally, but also mapping the landscape of who would be involved in any scaling effort. How do you coordinate with existing policies, sensitivities, stakeholders? Think about what are the capacities that would be needed in order for everybody involved to be using this and adapting it and further scaling it. How could all this be strengthened? We also really need to understand what things cost and what those costs are at different scales. We need to be balanced and clear about values too. Picking up on what you were just saying, Rob, about it's easiest to scale in higher resource, higher capacity areas, but if education equity is a key value, that has to be part of our scaling calculation. And that can sometimes make scaling even more difficult, maybe more expensive. Moreover, there might be really important trade-offs to explicitly contend with across equity, efficiency, and effectiveness, and we need to grapple with that head on rather than just assume. So all of this requires a really critical approach and a systems perspective. And overall, we found it really helpful not just to think about the biggest scale possible, but really to query what might optimal scale be for different interventions in a different context. I think I'm running out of time, but I just want to say one more thing about how important it is to also figure out what the scaling questions are in anything. I think we all know about teaching at the right level, a marvelous, effective, proven intervention developed in South Asia. So many countries are looking at how do you use and adapt a teaching at the right level of approach. And there's just so many pieces to that question. One of the pieces that we're getting to grapple with within KICS is supporting research into how do you help teaching at the right level really work in public education systems in Nigeria, Zambia, and Cote d'Ivoire. And just at the one tiny piece of this, which is how do you support the teacher mentorship and support and training that is necessary for teachers to actually really use this at the classroom level. There's a huge agenda around how do you make teaching at the right level work. And I think we also just have to be careful about what are the scaling questions that we can address at any one time and how can we contribute to a larger endeavor to figure out how this works. So in sum, we hope that this particular approach of positioning research to illuminate scaling questions will be useful to decision makers who need to know not just whether something works, but really how to make it work in real world conditions and at the level of interest of those who are responsible, not just for the pilot, but for the overall education system.
Thank you. Thank you for such a rich and layered response. Mathieu, I'll turn to you. And as the Chief of Education in the UNICEF Office of Research. And to begin, just the STEM policymakers like His Excellency Minister Adotwam can benefit from the research findings and feedback loops. At UNICEF Innocenti, how are you ensuring research is used to inform programs and innovation? And are there any specific examples of research co-creation that you can share with us? And I'll turn it to you.
Thank you, Sharon, and thanks for the invitation. I'm delighted to be with all of you today for discussing this topic so important for millions of children and their future life. So at UNICEF of Research at Innocenti, we, as you know, we are producing evidence. We are a research center, but at least as importantly, we are trying to really focus on what we can do to support the use of evidence at country level. All that, of course, in order to try to find solutions and improve policies for addressing the learning crisis that everybody has talked about before. Echoing Tricia, we are actually having two priorities. It's research on what works and research on how to scale up what works. Because at the end of the day, as Tricia rightly said, we just don't want to stop doing just research on pilots that never mainstream to the system level. So coming back to your question and just asking myself this question, is education research used enough? I think we would all agree here that the answer is no. And then the follow-up question is why? Is that because we are not good enough in disseminating the findings of research, communicating the findings of research, or is that for other reasons? And there are more and more researchers themselves that look at this specific question, and I'm sure you do that also at UPenn. What do they find? I like to quote the work of a PhD candidate at the London School of Economics. She has done an amazing job. She has looked at more than 500 research projects, 550 research projects actually, and she looked for each of them if they were leading to policy changes. And to answer the question, is the research used enough? She found out that actually only 10% of them led to policy changes. She found out a bit more than 50 out of the 550 projects that led really tangibly to policy changes and implementation changes for the learning of the kids. And when she looked at what were the factors associated with the fact to be used, the fact to lead to a policy change, what was the difference between those that led to policy change and the research project that didn't lead to a policy change, she found out that one of the key things was the co-creation, was the fact to have an early engagement of the stakeholders as part of the research. And it's a complete change of mindset. It's like when you are talking with many researchers, including in my office, we are always thinking, okay, what can I do to improve the use of my research? It's already too late in some ways. We have to think before actually on how to improve the use. So it makes sense also to me from a personal perspective, from my experience. I have been in research project for my whole life in some ways, I mean, since I work. And including when you are using the same methodology, I'm thinking about the methodology of, for example, education sector analysis. That is something that I'm sure you know, because it's usually part of the thing done as for doing an education sector plan that was mentioned before. The same methodology, the same support you will provide when there is the engagement from the Ministry of Education from the start, very likely you will see the result of the sector analysis being used for the sector planning and for the implementation and the service delivery in the schools. When there is no engagement, at the end of the day, it's mainly usually, okay, thank you very much, good book, up in the shelf, we tick that box for GPE and others, and nothing really happened. And I saw it concretely from my eyes. I remember a country, I will not name it, but where the analysis was not even finished, but it has been with a big involvement from the ministry team from the start. And the director of the ministry were presented in front of their minister and in front of the donors, the development partners at country level. And one example was that they show that in spite of the abolition of the school fees in that country, there were still some parents that were asked to pay for some informal fees by some schools. That was analysis coming from household survey. And we were kidding. The minister, when she heard that coming from her own director, showing it as part of an analysis, she just stood up and said, it is just not acceptable. I have a Michel-Hunous line in my budget. I will use all of it to do a spot check of all the schools to know what is the scope of this problem. And I will use also this line to compensate, because of course it was not a question of parents or school stealing money. It was just that money was necessary for the school to function, to buy chalks or whatever. So that's just one example that I saw that's exactly the type of thing we want to do. We want to do things that are actionable and actioned, basically. So to answer more concretely your question, our main strategy at University is to co-create with the intended user, in particular Ministry of Education, starting from the design stage, and to co-implement as much as possible the research as well. And it's more time consuming, it's more difficult, but it's definitely worth it for maximizing the use. And it also has the benefit to actually enable research capacity transfer, usually through a learning doing approach. So that's basically our approach. We try to apply it, and to give a few examples, because you asked also about example of co-creation. So one is, for example, in Uganda, Uganda was part of a research program we have on teacher absenteeism. We apply this model of co-creation with the Ministry of Education from the start. And again, even before the report was published, actually the findings of the research done together with them was used to develop the new incentive framework of the teachers in Uganda. So it was really like action again before the end of the end product was ready. Another example linking to what Rob and others have said before. At UNICEF, in addition to the Learning Passport, there are other digital solutions we are partnering with, in particular the Achilles digital language learning platform that is active in several countries and more countries, actually. It's a partnership with a foundation called the Achilles Foundation. It's active in different settings, including in Greece or in Lebanon for Syrian refugees, for example, and it was applied before COVID as a blended approach with still teachers in learning centers. And we are doing the research of this program in a co-creation way as well, with the foundation, of course, but also with the learning centers themselves. And the research includes feedback from the teachers on the way they use it. It includes also feedback with the learning centers manager. And it's a way to have, again, real-time research and the tool can be improved and adapted based on those feedback to make it more effective for learning. One example is that even if it's obvious, there were still issues of connectivity in some of the centers in Lebanon that led to a conversation with the developers, with the IT people to develop the offline version, the version of the platform working offline, the same way that Ron mentioned for the Learning Passport, for example. So maybe I will stop here. There are other examples, but I hope it was useful, and over back to you, Sean.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Matt. So with this, we are going to venture into round two. And for the audience, people who have joined us right now, you can type in your questions and we'll ask them towards the end. So in this round, we will primarily focus on education financing, on leadership, and how international intergovernmental organizations and the local governments can work hand in hand and more effectively to improve the situation, the crisis that we have. So I would request Dr. Adutwan, once again, respected minister. So we have spoken a lot about the challenges that we had even before COVID-19, and COVID added another layer of challenges, and we discussed some of those in our first round. So there's this need to urgently accelerate progress, and with this need, there's a push for more targeted education financing, better education financing. And my first question to you is that what steps as the Minister of Ghana, are you taking to improve the education financing to ensure more effective and targeted education financing in Ghana?
Thank you so much. I think in the area of finance of education, the traditional of finance and, in Ghana, for the most part, has become a situation where you look at your tax revenues coming in year in, year out, and then use that to budget, finance infrastructure, and other expenditures that you have to do. But I learned in the US how cities were issuing bonds to finance infrastructure, for example. And I always compare that to the Ghanaian situation. I see school buildings that take about 5 to 10 years to be completed because we are waiting on some tax revenue coming in from year to year. Compare that to the US, where a city in California will be able to pass a bond and use that to build the schools today and pay it down for a number of years. So if you compare that to our financing regime, you're going to see that we have to wait for 10 years to get a school done. In a California city, they would need a school now and pay it down in 10 years. So when we started the free secondary education, we saw that we needed to ensure that we can build the facilities that are needed so that we can stop the year-round schooling. Now, if we're using the traditional way of financing of our education infrastructure, it will take us 10 years or so to get it done. So we had to find a different way. And that different way was to look at, do a projection of all the revenues that we're going to get from a specific tax source. And then we securitize that. And we're able to raise 1.5 billion for infrastructure expansion. And now we have that money, we are building the schools and we're going to pay it down every year as the tax revenue comes in. So in a sense, we'll be able to do something that will have taken us 20 years to do, and we've done it now. And we are just waiting to pay the debts now. So it has to be a new way of doing business, a new way of doing school infrastructure. And the same thing applies to a whole number of things that we are doing in the education space, that we have to begin to look at the age-old problems of our nations in terms of education finance with a new set of eyes. We have to begin to look at it and say, couldn't we have done it differently? And that is what I'm beginning to see in Ghana. If you look at our support from international sources, now we are getting some grants from a number of not-for-profit organizations in the US and around the world, and we are focusing on that. We've set up a unit within the ministry that goes after these sources of funding. And that has never been the case. In very early, it was a question of waiting for somebody to call you and say, we are UNICEF and we can support you. But now we are saying Ghana has a need. UNICEF, even if you are supporting up to this amount, we want more. So we become more proactive in terms of demands, in terms of asking, in terms of requesting, and then going to the donor with a plan and say that if you can support us with this, this is how education system can change. So we are looking at the outcomes, and we have now a project that we're doing with the World Bank called the Education Outcomes Fund, and the private sector participation is part of the whole design. And this is about educating children who are out of schools, children on the street children. And we are asking private education providers to submit proposals as to how they can educate those children. And we are going to pay them based on the outcomes. If they are not able to integrate the children into the schools, they are not getting paid. So I believe that we need a different way, and we need to be able to look at how we can partner with the private sector, and also look at within our own structures how best we can bring efficiency to bear in our education system, and the outcomes that we get from there should be what should determine whether we are making progress or not, and not a process orientation that I have seen invariably where we say, okay, we can get this set up, but it's not about how do we ensure that the outcomes is visible for everyone to see. So when we look at all the things we have to do, we are prioritizing some things here. We are now investing in STEM. We also are beginning to do what are gifted and talented education. But we believe that we have some great minds and we have limited resources. We need to put some resources into how we can get them, their minds nurtured, and how we can get them to really bring out the increase in learning outcomes. So Gates education, we are beginning that. We are also doing more in terms of national standardized tests. In this country, Ghana, the first time you know if the students are doing at the national level was after 11 years of education. There was no national level assessment. And this year we have begun with primary 4 assessment, which is when the students are 10 years old, and want to link it up with the World Bank definition of learning poverty. We want to find out how many of our 10-year-olds can read and write. And once we're able to get the numbers, it will create a sense of urgency for us as a nation to look at. If we have 10%, then we know that we have a major problem, a major crisis, and that will call us to order to say you better do something right and do it right. So the national standardized test, which will be held on December 17th, is the first time in this nation where we are testing all 10-year-olds across the country in literacy and numeracy. And I think the results is going to be a wake-up call for us in terms of what we do. So thank you for the opportunity. I know I have so much to say, but I don't think I have all the time to say it. One of the things that excites me is about the fact that we are allowing research to inform what we do. UNESCO has partnered with one of the universities that have been given a status of Center of Excellence in Education Research, and their research is supporting what we do. I believe that without research, you are generally shooting through the dark. You really don't see the target. When we're able to use the research, as my colleague described, in terms of co-creation, you're able to really use it to inform what you're doing and then fine-tune it. And if the results are not coming, you know that the results are not there. So in Ghana, I believe that what we have going for us at this point is that we know exactly what we need to do to change the education system. And we see education as a means to an end. And so it's not an end in itself for us. We are a developing nation. We have poverty issues. How do we hold poverty at bay without transforming the education system, without making the education system relevant to the needs of our nation? So we want to position education squarely in the center and to say that if we can change our education system, we can get critical thinkers, then we can get a critical mass that will creatively lead this nation and bring about transformation. So we are determined that there should be an African success story. And I believe that based on what we are doing now, Ghana will be able to tell that story. That 10 years from now, we're going to see a high gross tertiary enrollment ratio, for example. Now we are 18.8%. No nation has transformed itself with a gross tertiary enrollment of 18.8%. So the president has set an agenda. By 2030, we want 40% gross tertiary enrollment ratio. Because I think that is the magic point where once you get number, you have a critical mass of people at the tertiary level, educated at the university level. And if you can get majority of them to be educated in STEM, then you can truly begin to see that magic work, and education will change our fortunes for us as a nation. We believe that we need to eliminate poverty, but there's no way we're going to be able to do that without quality, relevant education. Thank you for that.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Adolfo. I appreciate your responses.
Thank you.
I guess I'll go back to Robert. And Robert, before I ask you the questions that I have regarding some of the tech-related innovations that we spoke about and how countries can capitalize on these investments, I would like to tell our audience that Robert recently got back from Afghanistan. He was there on an official visit. And there was a lot of interest, Robert, in knowing what the situation pertaining to education is in Afghanistan right now, considering the change in government and leadership over there. And if you could also highlight how the girls' education is panning out in Afghanistan, considering the leadership change.
Well, thanks. So let me start there then. I think I was indeed in Afghanistan last week for a week. So it's an incredibly challenging situation. It's winter is fast approaching, particularly in the northern part of the country in the higher places, meaning there's, as those of you who don't know Afghanistan as well may not recognize that can lead to communities and parts of the country to be cut off for months. It's the level of poverty and the need to struggle to meet the basic minimum needs of children and their parents is phenomenal on a day-to-day basis. The full economic collapse or running a collapse, a potential of collapse, and the challenge of keeping services open are phenomenal. So that's the challenges. Now on the upside, the improved security situation, and what I mean by that is with conflict abating now, UNICEF and others have access to large parts of the country that were not accessible prior, like as in 6-7 weeks ago. And so, like for the example, the field trip I took was into an area that UNICEF staff had not been for 20 years. And I did have the incredible privilege of monitoring and engaging in an accelerated learning center in a community-based school for girls that there were 13, 14, 15-year-old girls that were learning for the very first time, learning their letters, learning their numbers in these learning centers, because of now the drop in conflict, and indeed now children are able to start learning who hadn't had access before. That's on so community-based learnings opportunities are growing, and that program is expanding. It's reaching about 500,000 children now, and will continue to grow with UNICEF support and others. The formal school system, as many may know, but was reopened for grades 1 to 6 for boys and girls, and for secondary age, older children, nationwide was open for boys. Yet to be announced opening for girls, but as of recently, like yesterday, the day before, I didn't see it yesterday, but the day before, 9 provinces of the 34 provinces have opened secondary schools for girls as well. Now, the spokesperson of the de facto authorities did announce 4 or 5 days ago that when schools reopen in March, they will, because of they're closed now, or about to close due to the in the cold parts of the country due to the season, and this is what the school calendar is that. So when schools reopen in March, there'll be all grades open to both boys and girls. So very quickly, we're also working across the country to enable that to happen, schools to be prepared, and to restart education. Teachers, the last time teachers were paid was formal school teachers was in August. So they are indeed an incredibly vulnerable population and needing support, and we're engaging with all that we can on how to provide support to teachers in the formal school system, while also expanding the community-based education system, basically providing all means to enable children to continue to learn at this very challenging time. To state the obvious, if teachers are not supported soon, the education system does run the risk of collapsing, and then obviously rebuilding an education system will be incredibly challenging, despite having an immediate impact on children that are currently studying. So it's really a challenging situation with the potential for us to make a real difference to marginalized children and children living in remote locations, children living all over the country. But it does require concerted effort and concerted engagement for all of us at all levels. It's a complicated situation to try and summarize in 5 minutes. I hope I did it justice. Osama, can I pass back to you?
Thanks a lot, Rob. That was a great insight, and we see potential for some improvement and hope as well. So we wish you the best in your work, and to the Afghan people as well. Now, coming back to our key question. So we have discussed how, as a response to COVID-19 disruption, international organizations and governments have made a lot of investment in education technology. From your perspective, how do you think that countries can capitalize on these investments and emerging evidence around these investments, around these edtech innovations, to build effective hybrid learning systems?
So I do think evidence, and I mean, it'll be interesting to hear other people's opinions. My own reading of the evidence is hybrid approaches are showing great potential, and we've learned a lot collectively. I feel like our learning over the last 20 months has been kind of on overdrive, just because of the expansion and the amount of tools and the amount of context and the amount of support going in this area. And people like yourselves at University of Pennsylvania and the students that are online, and I think can play a great role in partnering with those of us more operational to adopt these best practices and lessons, and so that all can benefit. UNICEF does, although Matt, the Chief of Education from Research, is online, he is definitely our best and brightest in helping us do more thinking. Those of us on the education program side tend to just be doing and not really thinking enough. So we really do appreciate those of you who are helping us think and use evidence. So let me throw out some 3 ideas on some of the lessons on adopting these hybrid approaches for discussion and for reflection. One is the importance of institutionalizing an EdTech intervention within education system, engaging with teachers can benefit, the system as a whole can benefit. There are interventions that we are supporting, we're involved in, that tend to be direct to households, direct to students. In some contexts, that is, I think, sometimes the only way or the way to reach scale quickly. But I think one lesson is the importance of leveraging school systems, institutions, embedding IT-enabled EdTech initiatives within school systems. That way, of course, we're leveraging that existing capacity and moving the mothership, if you'd like, in an effective way. And that does require a systems approach. It does require a methodical approach. It does require leadership, like His Excellency, the Minister of Education from Ghana, currently online, for that to be effective. But we're seeing great promise in many countries where indeed that's the case. Second, I come back to, and I'm sorry if I'm going to sound like a broken record, but any EdTech system initiative, but also hybrid ones, need to be sensitive to local context, need to be sensitive to the barriers that specific children face to access. Now, the tricky thing is here is barriers are very contextualized. Ultimately, it comes down to an individual, and they're also very much and sometimes you're looking right behind the curtain into households, because we are seeing, for example, girls having less access to technology in a home than their brothers may have. And so to be sensitive to that, and then working backwards from the dynamics within households, dynamics within communities, within school systems, within the tools themselves, to understand who is accessing, who's able to, how is this technology appropriate to each child and to each context, is critically important. So second is address the enable hybrid systems and technology systems to reach marginalized children and overcome barriers, and at the very least not to further put additional barriers to marginalized children. So we have to indeed recognize how important that is. The third then linked to that is, I don't want to get too sort of techie here, but the tools that are showing greatest promise are those that within the tool themselves embed some assessment of learning, assessment of the pathways, and provide immediate feedback to the learner, to those around the learner. So the scaffolding that's around the learner, whether it be parents, whether it be learning facilitators, teachers, etc. And you see like tools that are sometimes sold, like subscriptions, etc. Even the markers of success, the stars, the pathways. Children see where they're moving. They are able to choose where those directions. They track their progress, but so do those who are supporting them. And so that's a third lesson I would put in as a key attribute. We do have some tools that still need to be strengthened in that assessment piece. And that is, I think, then missing one of the great potentials of hybrid learning. Maybe I'll just sum up, and the last point is on leadership. We're definitely the countries that have leaders, and I mean at all levels, heads of state, presidents, prime ministers, ministers of finance, ministers of education, down through leadership of communities, of schools, of leaders in the sense of parents and teachers as well, but those who are committed to transforming education with these tools, committed to reducing disparities. There is a direct correlation to the extent of leadership and the performance of EdTech systems and the performance of education systems. So I do feel this is a leadership question and issue, and tools are easy in a sense of if we have that committed leadership, and in many countries we do, as evidenced by the minister here online.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you so much for your wonderful answer and your amazing work in the world. Every time I hear you, I feel so inspired to be better. Tricia, we're going to pivot to you. And again, I'll ask you both questions at once. So what are some of the key challenges in your experience that are seen in the knowledge mobilization process? And any suggestions that you have for researchers and leaders to make research useful?
Sure, thanks. Certainly, there are significant challenges to knowledge mobilization in the best of times. Capacities to access and use evidence, the challenge of translating evidence into very different contexts, a real need to understand cultures and incentives around evidence use, kind of an understanding of what it takes for institutions to change. This is not just a technical matter or a knowledge matter, it's a lot of political issues. I think if we step back, if knowledge mobilization was straightforward, we would not be struggling so much to address the climate crisis. For KICS, the normal barriers are compounded by COVID, and I'm really talking about in the context of an initiative that's all about inter-country learning. KICS Hubs and our Olive First project started on April 1st, 2020, which is kind of the worst day perhaps to have tried to start just as a pandemic hit, time of massive disruption, but that's when we started. In this, so many of our typical approaches to supporting knowledge mobilizations just weren't possible. All of our ideas for big international, regional face-to-face meetings had to pivot, of course, immediately to being online virtual instead. And I think there's just a whole lot of implications. We are missing all the informal exchange that happens where learning processing happens, where we connect with people and ideas and where we kind of ground what we were just doing kind of in plenary into our own lives and our own relationships. Engagements are so much shorter when we were face to face because people can't possibly be online for more than an hour and a half, like this webinar, half a day, full day, 3 days. No. Bandwidth is a serious limitation when you're trying to engage Eritrea or other countries where that's just a very much of a barrier. And I think we're also missing some of the organizational learning processes that we had before that were really trying to travel. So I just very much remember being in the Gambia, in the Ministry of Education in a meeting where in fact somebody had just come back from Ghana, Dr. Adutwam, actually learning from your early childhood education approach. Because she had just traveled, people asked her all about her trip. They wanted to know what did she learn. She was given space to report back in a meeting about what she learned and what she thought it was useful for the Gambia. However, when we are now limited to an hour and a half or 2 hour webinars, so many of our basic organizational learning processes are just not there. And I just think of my own experience. I work from home now for about 20 months. I'm sitting in a little office and I'm delighted to have an office. It's 6 by 7 feet. Even if I do participate in an excellent learning experience, once it's done, I close that window on my computer and I immediately return to all the rest of my work. There is no report. There's no trip report. All the places in which I would reflect on and document what I learned, where I would link what I was just doing with my own organization. I would tag my colleagues and introduce them to people, all the to-do lists. We've lost some of the routines and processes that were just early stage knowledge mobilization. And we do some of it, but we don't do it in the same way and we don't document it. At least this is my life. So even though that is the case, hubs have had to figure out how to be effective, not just to support knowledge sharing, but really also to move into that knowledge mobilization. And we're trying it in different ways, certainly balancing a lot of long reports with outputs that are much easier to digest and share. So I see a whole lot more short videos, podcasts, short briefs, little kind of interview clips. In addition, hubs have been trying to organize sense-making sessions. So they'll organize an event not just to do more knowledge sharing across borders, but actually just to pause and encourage people to name the policy takeaways of what they've been learning so far and share those so that people get other ideas of, well, what would I take away from what we were just doing over the last 6 months, let's say. Hubs have also balanced multi-country knowledge sharing with individual deep dives to discuss what are the national policy contexts more deeply and how and where this evidence and learning is applicable. One experience that we found really promising was just a number of weeks ago in Kenya, the people who are participating in KICS organized a national day. It was a hybrid where they were opening up to an extent that they could have some people in person as well as others online. And the people who are involved in this inter-country knowledge sharing invited additional stakeholders, and they especially wanted some of their senior officials. So they got the permanent secretary and the director general to come, because if you're going to try to mobilize knowledge, it can't just be from the technocrats, the people who are involved sort of in the day-to-day. They need to have senior leadership support and awareness of what's going on and a mandate to continue and a mandate to summarize and bring in what they were learning. So these are just examples of how do you structure and support a knowledge mobilization process. One other tiny piece of that Kenya experience that I really appreciated was that having engaged in this regional dialogue and intercountry knowledge sharing for such a long time, folks in Kenya had a nuanced understanding of the needs and interests of the countries around them. And when they had their National Dialogue Day, they not only talked about what are they getting out of this, knowledge and evidence, and how do they want to use it, but they also thought about, well, given what we're just hearing about, for instance, Malawi's interest, what can we share from what we're doing, and how can we best share that? And they know, for instance, that they're somewhat ahead in things like competency-based curriculum, and so they were talking about how can we kind of package that up so that we can be useful to countries in the region. And I was just really impressed with that generosity. And I think we all know that in this time of COVID, we are all desperately seeking to learn from one another about how do you make things work. I know in Kenya, for instance, they shared really practical tips in a webinar on how are they doing learning assessment of their competency-based curriculum during COVID with an equity lens. And that's a whole lot to layer on, but they had some really practical ways that they were doing it. I remember the conversations with folks from Lesotho who were just like, yes, I need to know more about what you're doing there. So I think COVID gives us opportunities and impetus, very much maybe in how Dr. Adeswam started. The second part of your question was how to make research more useful. And I'm mindful that the audience of this panel today are graduate students at the University of Pennsylvania. And so you're probably doing research right now, and you're probably thinking maybe about careers that might include some research. So I'm really happy to share some of what we're thinking, and it really connects very much to what Matt was just talking about. Our experience in KICS and in IDRC more generally, that's the International Development Research Center, an organization in Canada that's been supporting applied research for about 50 years. It's all about research for development, is that if you want research to be useful, you start way before you've got findings. And there's several aspects to this. You engage with knowledge users from the outset. I think I described that in regional hubs. KICS is defining knowledge innovation agenda grounded in the education priorities in the Global South. But in addition, individual projects link with relevant people. So whether those are in ministries or also other stakeholders, and they really need to be open to feedback about how do you adjust your research design. Maybe think about where your sites of fieldwork are going to be, so that you actually use that feedback and are open to changing your plans on the basis of what they say. You need to map the landscape into which any research questions about, in our case, adapting, scaling, interventions, how that's going to take place. What does the landscape look like and who's involved? A lot of the research that we support, a lot is really interactive. A lot is organized around plan, act, reflect cycles, so that you keep reorienting a research process as a project goes along to incorporate new opportunities, new insights, new realities. You're always looking for windows of opportunity to feed your research into debates or policy needs. That, of course, requires a lot of flexibility. And sometimes that's really hard to do when you have a design that you think maybe just needs to be implemented. But if you want it to be useful, you may need to adapt along the way. Matt has already talked about the co-creation approaches. I'll leave it to him to explain more on that, because we really appreciate all the work that you've been doing, Matt, and your Data Must Speak project is marvelous. IDRC also really believes in the value of Southern research. The majority of the projects that IDRC funds and also KICS's projects are actually led by Southern organizations. There are also others that are mixed with a lot of Northern and global organizations. UNICEF, in fact, leads 3 of them, and there's some very productive North-South partnerships. There are a number of things that are about Southern research that IDRC has found make it particularly useful for development. So number one, Southern organizations know the context in which they're working. They're from there, they're based there, there's an immediacy to it. Southern organizations will remain in place long after any individual project is over. And because research is only rarely relevant in the timeframe of any particular funded project, being there for the long term means that the organization can continue following lines of potential influence of that research long after any particular project is done. There are many examples of the same individual person occupying important positions in Southern academic and research contexts, moving to policy or even political roles, and then back again throughout their career. In fact, when I heard that Jaime was going to be on this panel, I thought, well, but here's the example of having led GRADE, a think tank in Peru for many years, and then becoming the Minister of Education. I think there's so many people who move back and forth, and they themselves are the natural interlocutors to keep research relevant and to bring evidence into policy. KICS has also, or IDRC has also learned from various evaluations that in fact research influence is generally more tied to the reputation, long-term connections, and positioning of an organization than any particular project. Again, that's part of having that long-standing, credible research organizations are the key having influence of evidence into policy. And finally, we have evidence that Southern research is high-quality research. So IDRC has commissioned independent experts to evaluate the quality of our research using measures not only just where it was published and how much it was cited, but really using measures that align to all our values around what makes for good development research. That includes and is foundational about scientific integrity, but also what's the importance and relevance of this research? How is it legitimate in terms of incorporating local knowledge, paying attention to gender equality and other ethical concerns, the extent to which it's well positioned to be used. So we ball all of that together into an assessment framework of the quality of research. And this was applied to a whole bunch of different projects, 170 of them across the globe in lots of different sectors. And in a meta-analysis across those showed that in fact, Southern-led research scored higher than Northern research or even partnered research when we were looking at all those dimensions. So we find that fascinating. To summarize what I've just been saying, I think it's important to tie agendas to the stated needs of the people that you think that your research is intended to serve. Listen really carefully to their priorities in the context at the beginning and throughout. Do research in context for that context, co-create knowledge, organize processes to feed flexibly into windows of opportunity as they arise, and think about who's doing the research and how that's going to be remaining useful long after your project is gone. Supporting Southern research organizations may be a good way to go.
Thank you. Thank you so much for such a powerful, substantive answer. Really appreciate you, Tricia. Matt, we will ask the last question of you. Well, we as us, but we have some audience members who will ask some questions of all of you. What is the potential of digital learning solutions for children, particularly the most vulnerable? And what, in your opinion, are key steps to achieve effective and inclusive digital learning for all students?
Thank you, Sharon, for the great question. I mean, I will not paraphrase what Rob said because he said a lot already, but there has been more and more research on the topic, as we all know, and based on this research, we recently did a policy brief for the G20 Task Force on Digital Transformation with Rob and his team, and with also the European Commission colleagues. And the policy brief was how to give good quality digital learning for every child. So I think I can just give a summary of that. It will answer your question. The first one is to close the electricity and connectivity gap for sure. Worldwide, we still have 2.2 billion children, meaning 2/3 of them, who do not have internet connection at home. In Africa, half of the population still don't have access to electricity. So basically, it means we need significant investment for electricity because based on current trends, if we don't improve the current trends, we will not have electricity for all before 60 years. So I think we should not wait 60 years to give some chance to the most vulnerable children, including some digital learning solution. Significant investment on connectivity is of course also needed. It could go through public-private partnership. We need also, of course, to provide the devices to zero rates, the package and subsidize the internet access for the data. And on the short term, as was said before, we need to have digital solutions that work offline, which is the way the digital solution that UNICEF is pushing is doing actually more and more. The Learning Passport, the Achilles, others, we know that we need to have those platforms also working offline in order to reach the most difficult context. Second, we did more and more research actually showing that technology alone is not enough. Rob said that a bit before as well. For improving learning outcome, the blended learning with still a big role for the teachers is more effective. So it means we need to also provide teachers with the skills to incorporate technology in their classroom or in their teaching. And linked to that, we know more and more that we need also a clear pedagogical approach, content, to guide the use of the digital digital learning, including from a young age. It's very, very obvious also for many research. Third, we need to protect children, including through the development and implementation of ethical regulation to protect their safety, their privacy, and to prevent all the risks associated with bit more and bigger access to digital learning and to technology. And finally, of course, I cannot finish a recommendation from research for asking for more research, but I think it's just very needed. It's also what is coming out from a research report where, for example, we are launching a new report with the World Bank and UNESCO Monday, again, about how to go from the crisis to recovery. And one of the key recommendations, again, is to improve the availability of learning assessment data. We need more learning outcomes data, because it's so important to know what works, what doesn't work in reference to learning. And it works also for when we are talking about digital solution. And we need also more implementation research. Researching on what are the best ways to implement those digital solutions, basically, in order to make them even more effective. And I want just to finish by something we have done also with Rob's team, which is a costing of universal digital learning. How much it would cost if we want to give digital learning to every child in the world. And the number sounds impressive. It's 1.4 trillion for the next 10 years. So basically $140 billion per year. And it's split basically a third for the electricity, a third for the connectivity, and the rest for data usage, zero rating, and all the learning solutions themselves, meaning the devices, the engagement, the teachers, the facilitators. So it looks like a bit, but actually it looks like a lot, but actually it depends on to what you compare, because the total cost of education every year is $4 trillion. So when you compare to that, it's not that it's affordable, we think. And when there is a will, there is a way. And also part of this cost, of course, is for things that could serve not only education, but also beyond education. We're talking about having Africa with universal electricity. Of course, the external positive impact would be beyond education. So I will stop here, Sharon.
Thank you. Not for stopping. I mean, I wish I could hear more, but thank you for your comments.
So we have a few questions that we gathered earlier and right now from the audience. And I know we are a bit short of time, but I'll try to squeeze in as many as we can. So our first question is for Dr. Adutwam. So Dr. Adutwam, the question basically pertains to digital learning in Ghana. And considering that Ghana has digital inequity, do you still believe that the Ghanaian education system can benefit from investments in digital learning, and it should be one of the priority areas?
Oh, definitely, of course. The inequity should cause us to even begin to look at how we can improve it. So bottom line is that we believe it's a frontier and it's a new frontier. We have begun the process of actually digitizing learning in some schools. We took custody of 34,000 tablets. It's going to be our pilots in some primary and junior high schools, where content is going to be digitalized in such a way that students are going to do literally virtual learning when it demands in the classroom to a hybrid system. So yes, but the thing is this, that it's just not going to be putting tablets in front of students or computers in front of students. It's what we use it for. As I learned in Los Angeles and other places with deployment of technology, it's not so much the fact I have iPad, it's what are you going to use it for? Have you digitized the content in such a way that there are hyperlinks embedded in the content in such a way that if we're studying about Egypt, with a click of the hyperlink, it takes them to go and see the pyramids in Egypt. So it's not just the device, the hardware, but the software is so critical Otherwise, we'll not get the benefit that we need to get from the digital devices as we have talked about. And also, I think one critical thing is how do you use all the opportunities that artificial intelligence provide to customize learning for the students in such a way when you assess the student, you know where they are and what they need to do in order to improve learning. So I think when we bring devices and at the same time look at the e-content and look at how we can use new ways of teaching and learning to improve the teaching and learning environment, then the device investment is worthwhile. We're also looking at the device and how it saves us some money from textbooks, for example. So whenever proposals come to me, I tell them, you have to tell me that if I was to adopt this device, the amount of money it's going to save. And so the device application in terms of how it will help teaching and learning, and the fact that the students are acquiring 21st century skills, sometimes can become a bonus, because if you look at 3 years, 4 years, 5 years using the device compared to the books that you buy and the cost of the books, invariably, if you do a very good arithmetic of it, are you going to see that the device is costing maybe just 25% of what you thought was the cost of the device, but you are saving so much money. So we are looking at all these in terms of our adoption and to be able to say that if we are saving this amount of money, then we actually don't need don't look at the 100% of the cost, but actually maybe it's about 25% of the cost of the device. So yes, we know that digital divide is real in Ghana. We're looking at how do we get technology deployed at the last mile. That's why we look at offline applications, which may go online once a month so that we can pick up all the data. And with that, we'll be able to get the technology in locations where it is needed the most to improve teaching and learning. So yes, that's my response to your question, that we definitely need the devices, but we have to be very strategic about it in terms of cost saving and in terms of additional benefits that it brings to our country.
Thank you, Dr. Dotun. Next question is for Robert Jenkins. So, Robert, you spoke about Afghanistan, and since UNICEF works in a lot of countries with conflict and fragile zones, so the question basically pertains to that a lot of these countries have millions of out-of-school children. Some of these out-of-school children are in an age bracket where it is difficult to bring them back into the formal schooling system. So should there be more of a focus on giving them life skills, vocational training, skill development, rather than huge investments on basic and primary education? And if so, what is UNICEF doing for that?
Great question. Thanks for looping back. Indeed, so UNICEF works in 140 countries, and we do spend the majority of our resources in countries that require the resources the most. And so those are fragile, poorest countries. It's like a simple kind of formula. You know, it's a very interesting question. I would answer it by saying yes, I think we need to provide multiple learning pathways for children that meets their individual context, but also is sensitive and appropriate for their aspirations. And so I used to work for UNICEF in Jordan at the time of, well, still there's a crisis in Syria and others, but at the time, at the height of that, and meeting children that were affected by conflict coming to Jordan as refugees. You know, they hadn't studied sometimes for their entire lives. Some had studied minimally, and you ask them, so what would you like to be? I'd like to be a doctor. I'd like to be a world-class surgeon. I'd like to be, and you know, you have a 14-year-old who's never studied. So to assume that actually that 14-year-old, they haven't had an opportunity to learn, so they should be more appropriate to go to a vocation or another, but actually they want to be a surgeon. So we should figure out a way, regardless of each child's immediate context, how to realize their vision. So what we have to, their goals, their dreams. So what we have to avoid is providing substandard, secondary, sort of lower capacity education opportunities for those children that have faced barriers sometime in their lives. What it, I think, does necessitate is certified learning through multiple learning pathways. Ideally, those pathways also overlap and intermingle. So you're on this track, then you're on that track, then you're on this, then you're on that. And so again, it can respond to each individual child's needs and desires, but also not fix them in streams that they can then not get out of. And that also, we have high income countries that have followed that track and still do, by the way, these famous tests at younger ages that put you in streams that you can then not get out of. Thank goodness that didn't exist in a small town in Canada where I grew up, because if I would have taken a test at 10, I'm sure I would be not having the learning opportunities that I ended up having. So I'm a great believer in diversity of tracks. They merge at many, many points, and all of us work collectively to enable each child to realize their goals and dreams.
Thanks.
Robert, that is the perfect sentence and thought and wish that we should all honor and manifest together. And I just want to say this session, like the one that many of us did last year, this is our professional development. And I'm so grateful to each of you for the ways that you're working to embody and do what Robert just said, right? To create equitable, elevating systems for all children. So I just want to take this moment to thank each of you for your work in the world, for running the engines of your respective organizations with such criticality. And I would like to give the minister a moment to give closing remarks, Your Excellency, and then we will end this. So before we hand it over to Minister Adutwum, I just want to say on behalf of the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Education and the University of Pennsylvania's Perry Worldhouse, thank you, each and all of you, for your wisdom and for the ways that you're helping to heal the world. Your Excellency, Dr. Adutwum.
Thank you so much, UPenn. You've gotten ahead of University of Southern California. They haven't called me yet. Now, so you guys have done a good job. I'll tell you one thing. In Ghana, one of the things that I believe will define our legacy this time between myself and the president is the fact that we're doing a project that we call Communities of Excellence. In this project, we identify 100 communities where we are challenging ourselves and challenging them to ensure that 90% of all students will reach our proficiency levels by age 10. And that 90% of our junior high school graduates from these communities will move on to high school. And 90% of the high school students will move on to university. This is what we call the Communities of Excellence project. I'm so much committed to this. So many people are coming on board. In this 100 communities, we want to show the world that if you create the right ecosystem where you involve parents, you involve the chiefs and community leaders, you will have this manifesting where you're going to have a 70% gross tertiary enrollment ratio for that generation. And their numbers, their data, their statistics will be just like any town in America. And that is what we are challenging ourselves with. And I want to seek your support as we move through this process of a 90-90-90 agenda. 90% proficient levels in reading and numeracy by age 10, 90% junior high school to high school transition, 90% high school to university transition, 100% across Canada. Thank you for such a wonderful opportunity.
Thank you. And you have our support. Let us all continue to walk together in this. It really requires that we become comrades in what really is a fight for the transformation of our world, to really educate everyone. So thank you, Your Excellency. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to those of you who joined us today. And be well. Be well as you heal the world. We are wishing good things for you. Thank you to each of you. And thank you to Usama for putting all of this together. Thank you
Thanks a
so
lot,
much.
everyone. I appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
Thanks for the
Thank
opportunity.
you, everyone.
Bye.
Be well. Take care. Thank you.